Hey everybody, as Stranger Things Season 3 draws near, I've got one more theory video to share with you. Now, much of the logic behind this theory is based on details from two of the recently released Stranger Things books, Suspicious Minds and Darkness on the Edge of Town. Just so you know, I'm going to be spoiling some details from both books, but I'll try to withhold as many specifics and juicy details as possible if you would still like to read those books, save for one big plot point in Suspicious Minds that is essential to this theory. As a whole, these books provided some much needed backstory for both Terry Ives and Jim Hopper respectively, along with quite a few side characters we've already seen. In addition to some very eye-opening plot details, these books also provided enough random data to construct a sizable timeline of character events and locations prior to 1983. There are still some holes to be filled in, but it seems like many of the timeline events after 1968 are firmly established in these books. And as this video goes, I will examine this timeline and discuss many of the possibilities and character overlap hidden within it. Now, the character Sarah Hopper has always been very interesting to me, and the great mystery surrounding her apparent death has led me to make a few videos about the topic. But following the release of Season 2, I had really come to a place where I just felt like Hopper didn't need to dwell on Sarah anymore. Because from a story standpoint, Sarah had been effectively replaced by Eleven, completely filling that void in his life, and by becoming Eleven's new father, Hopper has brought a much needed warmth and stability into her life. Two birds, one stone. It's the perfect solution. But how strange would the dynamic of their relationship become if Sarah Hopper was reintroduced right now? Because of Hopper's seemingly repaired home life, I was more than ready to put any remaining Sarah Hopper theories to bed. That is, until I read the Suspicious Minds book about how Terry Ives came to meet Dr. Brenner and begin the experiments at Hawkins' lab. This book features a detail that basically makes it impossible for me to not address the possibility that Hawkins' lab absolutely could have faked Sarah's death, and they could have done it in a few different ways. As I read this book, imagine my shock when Terry Ives convinces a 6-year-old Kali, also known as 8, to use her powers of illusion to fake another character's death in a Hawkins lab hospital bed. Well man, that seems kind of like a precedent, don't you think? The plan called for Kali to remain in her room and continue the illusion long enough for the phantom body to be taken to the morgue, while the real test subject tried to escape. The only problem with a plan like this is that eventually a staff member would notice the body was missing after the illusion wore off. But in a situation like this, the plan was only to escape, so it wouldn't really be a problem. But the book never gives us the scene where Brenner figures out what happened, but up to that point, the book makes one thing clear. Kali is powerless to keep the truth from Dr. Brenner. It is plausible that Brenner got Kali to spill the beans on what she did, and then Brenner absolutely could have forced Kali to create the illusion again to fake another death, and maybe more than once. Just imagine how well Dr. Brenner could have improved upon a fake death plan like this. We've already seen that Brenner is capable of producing convincing fake bodies. Think of how quickly they produced Will's fake body in Season 1, after unexpectedly needing it in like half a week's notice. You think they did that without some amount of previous experience? I mean, Brenner probably has a fake body guy on speed dial. I mean, that's the only way they pulled that off. Probably just sent him a photo or something. Brenner would have had likely a year or more to mark Sarah Hopper as a worthy test subject in 1979, and all he had to do was get a fake body produced at his leisure, and when the time was right, swap it out on the bed after Kali tricked Hopper into seeing Sarah flatline. Hopper and Diane could have been frantically watching Sarah sleeping peacefully in her bed in an empty room, while Brenner walked in and picked her up, as a loyal henchman, maybe this guy, placed the fake body in the bed. I mean, sure, we never see the flatline begin. Hopper could have easily ran into the room to see real doctors doing fake CPR on a dummy, but that's many more doctors and nurses that have to keep a secret, and faking the flatline could have been more tricky too. It would have been much easier for Kali to create the illusion from nothing and use the dummy for funeral purposes after the fact. It's not like this would have been an impossible act when Kali had already created essentially the same illusion almost 10 years earlier in 1970. You really gotta wonder how many times Brenner could have pulled off this kind of fake body child switch, especially if he had Kali to help him during much of that time. And this would really deepen Kali's character too, who would now not only hate Brenner for what he put her through, but for what he made her do to other people. But if you're wondering how Dr. Brenner could have ever gained access to Sarah in the first place, shortly we're going to be discussing a pretty plausible connection between those two characters. And when I get to that, I think you're really going to like it. But first, to better examine any direct overlap between all of the relevant characters, let's break down this expanded character timeline. Jim Hopper was born in 1942, and 18 years later in 1960, he graduated from high school. Hoping to get out of Hawkins, Indiana, he signed up for the Army, and soon enough, he found himself in Vietnam where he did 2 tours from 1962 to 1968. Returning to Hawkins in 1968, Hopper joined the Hawkins Police Department, where he would work for a stretch of 3.5 years. Sometime in 1969, Hopper would meet his first wife, Diane, and would marry her sometime within the next 2 years. Dr. Martin Brenner first arrived at Hawkins' lab in July 1969, with a 5-year-old collie sleeping in the back seat. Terry Ives first volunteered to be a test subject in the same month of 1969. In 1970, Terry enlisted the help of a 6-year-old collie to create an illusion that another test subject had died in order to help them escape the facility. Hopper's daughter, Sarah, was born in April 1971, and the funny thing is that this is the same year that all the other kids in the main cast were born, 11 included, although the Terry Ives book says that Jane was born 2 months early in June 1970, at which point she was taken by a disguised Dr. Brenner, even though in Season 1, Joyce Byers said that Jane had been missing for 12 years in November 1983. Either way, this makes Hopper's connection to 11 that much more meaningful, seeing that his daughter would have been her age if she were, or if she is, still alive. In 1974, Terry Ives broke into Hawkins' lab and found a 3-year-old Jane and a 10-year-old collie playing together in the Rainbow Room, before Terry was captured and taken away to get her mind scrambled. Hopper was a detective in New York City from 1972 to at least December 25, 1977. But what happens to Hopper between 1977 and 1979 is the greatest remaining mystery for us, outside of his time spent in Vietnam. You see, all that we know is that his daughter Sarah dies of what seems to be a cancer-like condition in 1979. And some months later, he rejoins the Hawkins PD, this time as police chief, a position he holds all the way up until 1983, the start of Season 1. At some point between December 1977 and 1979, Sarah starts to hyperventilate while Hopper was chasing her through a park, as seen in one of Hopper's flashbacks. Based on the weather outside and their jackets, I would say that this is either early spring 1978 or fall 1978. The next flashback we see of Sarah is her completely bald in a hospital bed, seemingly in between chemotherapy sessions. After watching Season 1, no one really questioned the idea that Sarah's death must have taken place in a hospital. But after the events of Season 2, many fans discovered that the railing of the stairwell in the Hawkins lab facility looks exactly the same as the railing of the stairwell in which Hopper cries in anticipation of his daughter's death 5 years earlier. And yes, it is the same style railing, seemingly inside the same building, which means that Sarah Hopper was being treated for a cancer-like condition at the Hawkins lab facility sometime in early 1979. In fact, the ECG monitor we see in the flashback is the same exact model of monitor we see in the Hawkins lab room where Will is being treated after his collapse in Season 2. And before you say that's just a coincidence, actor David Harbour has already confirmed these two locations are the same. He couldn't really get into it for obvious reasons, but he did confirm this was Hawkins' lab. But why would Hawkins National Laboratory even be treating a cancer patient? And I must admit that at first glance it does seem odd, but it turns out that Season 2 revealed another detail that could explain all of this. In Season 2, Episode 7, Eleven recognizes a photo of Ray Carroll in a newspaper clipping. Ray was the ECT therapist at Hawkins' lab who scrambled Terry's mind in 1974, but had since retired from his position at that point in 1984. And if you read this newspaper clipping, you find a pretty interesting breakdown of the different departments inside Hawkins' lab. Long-standing employee Ray Carroll spent his last few hours at the Hawkins National Labs strolling the hallways and saying his goodbyes. Ray started as an orderly in the hospital wing of Hawkins back in 1969. He was honorably discharged from the Army Medical Corps after 3 tours in Vietnam, working in the MASH units. Ray took the night school degree courses offered by the Department of Energy so he could advance through the Hawkins system. He finished up as a fully qualified ECT therapist, working in the pediatric unit of the Hawkins Research Hospital. Ray worked closely with several Hawkins research doctors in the parapsychology department. So there you have it. According to a local newspaper, the Hawkins lab facility has a hospital wing referred to as the Hawkins Research Hospital, which includes a pediatric unit. It's not like this was a separate facility he had been promoted to. They said he spent his last few hours saying his goodbyes and strolling the hallways at Hawkins National Labs. He was still there. Clearly, we've seen the hospital wing many times at this point. We just didn't realize it was open to the public, or at least open to extreme cases, likely in need of experimental treatments. Maybe the Rainbow Room was part of the pediatric department. It didn't take Terry long to find it, so it's not like it was in the basement. What exactly causes Hopper to move back to Hawkins after Sarah gets sick isn't clear, but it could be that Hopper couldn't afford to continue Sarah's expensive cancer treatments in a swanky New York hospital, especially if the NYPD didn't offer health insurance in 1978, and his wife Diane was just a school teacher, so maybe no insurance there either. It could have been that Hawkins General Hospital, where Will was taken at the end of Season 1, didn't have a pediatric department, or was still too expensive, so Sarah was then referred to the Hawkins Research Hospital at Hawkins Lab to continue her treatment. Now, many research hospitals are non-profits, usually subsidized by the government, and offer treatment services at no cost to the patient. The presence of this Hawkins Research Hospital and the low to no cost treatment could explain how Hopper and Sarah had been to this facility without directly meeting Dr. Brenner, who may have been stealing peeks at outside patient charts looking for potential fits into his testing program. It is likely that her high level of intelligence is what caught Brenner's eye.
My daughter. She won the spelling bee today.
Is that right?
Yeah, she's smart. She's real smart. I don't know where she gets it from. I've been trying to figure that out for years.
Many of the missing kid newspaper clippings that Eleven sorts through at Terry's house only mention how smart each of the missing kids were, so a high IQ is clearly a big factor that Brenner looks for. It is not clear how many test subjects could have been taken directly from the research hospital, considering many of those kids were already battling life-threatening conditions. But do we have any idea as to how Sarah even got cancer in the first place? Well, if we consider the heavy usage of Agent Orange in Vietnam, it's likely that Hopper could have been exposed to the dangerous chemical during one of his 2 tours in Vietnam. Agent Orange was a powerful herbicide used by the US military from 1961 to 1971 in order to eliminate any forest cover for the Viet Cong troops. But because this herbicide also contained TCDD, a type of dioxin, it proved to affect far more than plant life. If Hopper was exposed to it, it may have greatly affected the development of his daughter, who was only conceived after he returned to Hawkins in 1968. The chemical is so toxic that it basically alters the DNA of those exposed to it, and this altered DNA is then passed down to subsequent generations, and the resulting lineage can be plagued with bodily deficiencies. Even their grandchildren and great-grandchildren can continue to show symptoms, all stemming from that first exposure generations earlier. Some Vietnam vets only begin to show more advanced symptoms of this exposure later in life, so Hopper may not be out of the woods yet either. This chemical exposure could be why Hopper feels personally responsible for what happened to Sarah. He calls himself a black hole, and this is likely the reason why he could be. And not to make light of this issue, considering how serious of a topic this actually is, but I suppose, in a science fiction story like this, it's possible that this chemical exposure could have led to Sarah developing new abilities that could have been further developed if Brenner had brought her into his testing program. This is not unlike how Terry Ives' exposure to LSD while she was pregnant with Jane likely enhanced Jane's own set of psionic abilities. I do think it's important to note that because these 2 girls were initially exposed to 2 different chemicals before they were born, this likely indicates that they did not develop the same power. Eleven had LSD absorbed into her from her earliest possible point, while Sarah likely only began LSD experiments when she was 7 or 8 years old. But because of such early exposure in both cases, we could be looking at 2 very evenly matched test subjects. Although it seems likely that Sarah had a power set that would not be as useful to Brenner as Eleven's, which could have bred some amount of resentment in Sarah. This is not to say that Eleven has ever actually met Sarah, but even if she saw her in passing, she was likely only known as Subject 12. But we really aren't sure that Brenner even kept Sarah in the same facility, if he kept her at all. But it is not hard to believe that 11 and Sarah could have been effectively separated for the 4 years they may have shared the same facility. We have to remember that 11 and 8 were kept in the same facility for years, and while they often played together, sometime after 1974, they never saw each other again. But 11 only escaped the facility in 1983. It is never clearly stated what year Kali escaped from Hawkins' lab, only that when her gifts were strong enough, she used them to escape. Kali was born in 1964, meaning that in 1979, the year of Sarah's apparent death, she would have been 15. So let's just operate under the idea that perhaps Kali did this one last favor for Brenner, allowing for Brenner to use her illusion powers to trick Hopper and Diane into thinking that Sarah had died, and the act of doing so disgusted her so much that she vowed to run away. I do find it kind of interesting that as Jane talks to Kali on the roof, she never once refers to Hopper by name. Kali just calls him your policeman. It's not clear whether Kali would remember him by name anyway. It's still possible that Kali would recognize Hopper if she met him in person. I have to say that it does seem odd that Hopper acts very suspicious of Hawkins' lab in Season 1 and goes through the motions of investigating them as if he's never heard of them before, when it would seem like he already had previous history with them. But if we consider the Hawkins Research Hospital as a separate wing of the building, that could be enough separation to overlook or at least not mention his experiences to the other officers, because those memories are tied to his grief about Sarah, something we know Hopper avoids talking about whenever possible. And if Hopper never found anything suspicious during his previous time there, he could have felt that none of it was relevant to the current investigation. If nothing else, maybe we can assume that his easy navigation of those hallways is some kind of an indicator that he still had some vague understanding of their floor plan from his time there 4 years earlier, or that him being back in the building recently to check their camera feed has jogged his memory. Now, I never would have even considered making a video like this if the Suspicious Minds book didn't feature a 6-year-old Kali successfully using her powers to convince Dr. Brenner himself of a fake death in a Hawkins lab hospital bed. I mean, it's not even a stretch to say that this is a possibility. The exact precedent has already been set. And if a 6-year-old Kali could trick Dr. Brenner himself, you really can't convince me that a 15-year-old Kali couldn't make that illusion more than convincing enough for Hopper and his wife. And because Dr. Brenner is capable of producing convincing fake bodies, it's much more likely that the illusion stuck this time. This all makes me believe that if Hopper were to dig up his daughter's grave, he would find a body that is not decomposed at all, because it's just a stuffed dummy. Well, it'll be interesting to see how Season 3 plays out, and hopefully this theory proves to be true because it would make the dynamic between Hopper, 11, and Sarah all kinds of conflicted, especially if Sarah has formed a deep allegiance to Brenner, perhaps even calling him Papa. I'm sure Hopper would love that. Well, this concludes the theory. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and consider sharing this video so more people can find it. I would really appreciate that. Now, be sure that you're subscribed and turn on notifications because I'm going to be making some new theory videos after the release of Season 3. So tell me, what do you think of this theory? Do you think Brenner used Kali's previous experience faking a death to do it again? What do you make of the Hawkins Research Hospital mentioned in the newspaper? Does this prove that Sarah was at the facility without already being part of a secret program? And do you think that Sarah was just beginning to develop special abilities? And if so, what power could she have? Let me know in the comments below, and hit me up on Twitter at Planet Calvin. Let me know what you think. I'm really interested. Be sure to subscribe for more content like this, and thanks for watching.